Next up are practical applications of immunology. So that's a really interesting chapter, actually. Now that you kind of have an overview of how the immune system works, the next question is usually how can we make use of that knowledge? And the first thing that comes to mind is vaccination. And that is the biggest accomplishment that came out of understanding how the immune system works. So we started out with Edward Jenner, and he developed the first vaccine, which came out of the observation that milkmaids that were exposed to a virus carried by cows, which is cowpox, that they never seemed to get smallpox, which was killing millions of people in Europe at the time when they had outbreaks. And he made the observation that milkmaids, they seem to somehow be resistant or immune to getting smallpox. And his idea was there must be something about this exposure to cowpox that makes you immune to smallpox, which is much more dangerous for humans. So he actually used his own son, which is pretty brave, I think. And he put a small amount of cowpox, the crusted stuff from the pustules that are formed from a cowpox infection. So he scratched that underneath the skin of his son, then waited a couple weeks, and then exposed his son to smallpox, and he didn't get it. And so basically that was sort of his proof of the effectiveness of his first vaccine. So anyway, we got the name vaccination from that first vaccine, and vaca means cow, and that is how the term vaccination still has this vax, VACC. Anyway, so that was the big story, that Jenner inoculated cowpox to prevent smallpox and then exposed people to smallpox, and they didn't get it. From there on, there are many vaccines now have been developed, and we still keep that name, vaccine, to remind us of the first one from vaca, the cowpox. So a vaccine is a suspension of organisms or fractions of organisms that induce an immune reaction. Typically involves the formation of antibodies against that particular pathogen. So a vaccine provokes a primary immune response, leads to the formation of antibodies, and since there is really no infection going on, these plasma cells that have learned to make the correct antibody, they will be quickly converted into memory cells, and then they stay around. And if you actually get infected with that same pathogen, then these memory cells get converted back into plasma cells and churn out antibodies really fast, and you don't have to get sick. Just here on a sideline, I will never understand these anti-vaxxers. That is, to me, very strange, because vaccination is definitely one of the biggest success stories of medicine overall. And anytime there's a vaccine available for something, I'm always first in line. But I just from understanding how a vaccination works, it's, I've mentioned this before, it's like getting the final exam 2 weeks in advance, and you get prepared. You have time to get ready. You know what to expect, and then you are scoring a perfect score. So a vaccination is giving your immune system a head start on making the correct antibody and then being ready in case that pathogen hits. And some pathogens, they're really not playing around. They kill you fast. They kill you maybe faster than you are able to make an antibody. And so having the memory cells ready that can be quickly converted into plasma cells, and then you don't have to get sick, I just don't see how somebody would reject that or say that this is in some way bad or dangerous. There are all these misconceptions out there, rumors and false information, conspiracy theories and whatnot. You should not believe that. Vaccination is great. Anyway, so that's my opinion on this. And here, let's move on here with the principles and effects of vaccination. So you get the antibodies and the memory cells. That is the main thing. And then you are ready for, in case your immune system is faced with this pathogen, then you have a rapid and intense secondary response because you're converting the memory cells back to plasma cells, and your antibodies are almost immediately available. Let's talk about a term that you may have heard recently too. It's called herd immunity. That means if enough of the population is immune to a pathogen, then it will not be able to spread. So that means outbreaks, if any, they are sporadic because the chain of transmission is basically broken. There are too many holes in the chain of passing on this pathogen. And so herd immunity, basically, even if there are some anti-vaxxers out there, they're usually protected because the rest of the population is immune. And so they think, well, I don't have to get vaccinated, so it's great. I don't even need to go through this because I'm protected anyway. But it really doesn't work. If too many people decide to be anti-vaxxers, then you will see outbreaks of mumps and measles and all of those things again. Because vaccination is such a great thing, many vaccines have been developed over the years, and as far as I know, you have to get a special permit to send your kid to public school and without vaccinations. Most of us, if not all of us, have to prove that we got vaccinated or that our children got vaccinated before we can send them to public school. And so here's a list of vaccines that are used in the United States to prevent bacterial diseases first here. The first one is usually the first shot that babies get. There'll be Haemophilus influenzae type B meningitis. That would be the Hib vaccine. And then we have also meningococcal meningitis. That one, you have to be a little bit older to get this one. And it's not necessarily a routine vaccination. Then we have pneumococcal pneumonia. And then here is one shot that everybody should get. The triple shot of tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis, TDP, and this new one is an acellular pertussis, so that's called a DTAP for acellular pertussis. And here's your vaccination schedule. You can take a look at this. You should get a Tdap booster every 10 years. That's kind of an interesting thing too. And then here are some vaccines that are used to prevent viral diseases in humans. Chickenpox, hepatitis A and B, herpes zoster, the human papilloma viruses. That one is given to boys and girls that just before puberty to prevent cervical cancer. So it's basically a cancer vaccine because we know that human papilloma viruses are almost entirely responsible for the cervical cancers that we see in humans. Of course, just women get cervical cancer because they only have a cervix. So why vaccinate boys? Well, because then they can't transmit the human papilloma viruses to their partners, and so that's a good thing. The flu shot is given annually because the flu virus is a retrovirus, changes all the time. So we need to get a new vaccine every year because your immune system needs to make new antibodies against the current spike proteins that the flu virus has. And here are more vaccines that are used to prevent viral diseases. Really, vaccination, that is the way to go against viral diseases, to prevent viral diseases. And that's why everybody is frantically trying to develop a coronavirus vaccine. We don't really have a whole lot of medications, if any, really effective ones. I mean, there's some against HIV, for example, but viruses are really hard to treat. Once the virus is inside of your cells and reprograms them, it's really hard to treat these viral infections. The best way to go is to have antibodies ready so that you get the virus before it even can cause any damage. And here are some more routine vaccinations against viruses. The MMR, mumps, measles, rubella, so it's kind of separated out here. Mumps, measles, rubella, that's usually a triple shot that is recommended for all children. And then polio is also a recommended shot for all children. Rabies is usually only given if you need it. So here they're saying field biologist. The rotavirus is also not a routine vaccination, but you can give it to infants. And then smallpox, they stopped vaccinating because it's considered that this disease is eradicated from Earth. And so therefore, even though this was the very first vaccine, we don't have any cases anymore. The last case was sometimes in the late 70s. And so smallpox is only considered potentially as a bioterrorism agent. And there are vaccines available if we were to ever need it. But at this point, I think only certain military personnel will be vaccinated. Let's take a look at the types of vaccines and their characteristics, basically how they're being made. So maybe the most popular way of making a vaccine would be to use live attenuated vaccines. So that means you're weakening the pathogen and basically then giving a weakened pathogen to look to your immune system and let it work out the antibody. So the positive thing about it is that it closely mimics the actual infection, except that the virus is, or the pathogen is attenuated. It's weakened and it can't make you sick like the regular pathogen would. But to your immune system, it causes your immune system to respond as if this was the real pathogen. So the type of immunity that you get out of that is usually lifelong cellular and humoral immunity. If you're using inactivated or killed pathogens, that's safer, of course, than if you're a weakened but still alive pathogen. So it's safer, but it usually requires booster doses and it induces mostly humoral immunity. That means you're making antibodies, but you don't have any cellular immunity. You see somebody injecting a virus into an embryonated egg, and then the virus will grow in this fast dividing embryonic tissue. That's a very common way to make flu vaccine, for example. They're always looking for some alternatives, but this is sort of the traditional way of making the flu vaccine. It's just that some people are allergic to egg and egg products, and so therefore they might have an allergic reaction to a vaccine that was produced in embryonic eggs. So here are some more types of vaccines and their characteristics. So subunit vaccines, those are very popular. They use antigenic fragments to stimulate an immune response. We have recombinant vaccines where the subunit vaccine was produced by genetic modification. Usually you're using bacterium to produce these subunit vaccines and then inject these recombinant vaccines into people that need to be vaccinated. Then we have virus-like particle vaccines. They resemble intact viruses but do not contain viral genetic material. That's another popular way. And then toxoids. Those are inactivated toxins that don't cause the toxic effect, but they cause you to make antitoxins. So that means then after the vaccination has produced the antibodies, then you have serum that contains antibodies against the toxin. And if your body ever sees that toxin, then it will not have the toxic effect. Moving on to conjugated vaccines. These are used for diseases in children with poor immune responses to capsular polysaccharides. So a conjugated vaccine is sort of a way to stimulate your immune system to make certain type of antibodies or have an immune response. Nucleic acid or DNA vaccines, those are interesting. So here you're injecting naked DNA and it produces the protein antigen encoded on the DNA in the host cell. And then that protein antigen is carried to the red bone marrow and stimulates humoral and cellular immunity. So it's sort of an indirect way to stimulate an immune response. The development of new vaccines is sort of, it's kind of tricky because there's not much money to be made. Pharmaceutical companies, they definitely make a lot more money on medicines than they would make on vaccines. And so a lot of times the government actually has to encourage them, give them incentives to develop new vaccines. And so there are definitely right now, everybody's looking for that magic COVID-19 vaccine. But vaccine development has taken on different directions. For example, they're trying to make vaccines without the use of animals, use plant sources to make vaccines, make more oral vaccines that don't need to be injected, and develop more vaccines for chronic diseases.